He never expected his boss to ask for privacy, but when she did, everything between them changed. The office was unusually quiet that late afternoon. Sunlight slanted through the blinds, painting warm stripes across the polished wooden floor. I was finishing the last of my paperwork when I noticed her approaching, my boss, poised as always, moving with that effortless grace that made her presence impossible to ignore. Her heels clicked softly against the floor, a sound that always seemed louder in moments of tension. She stopped just behind my chair, her gaze focused and calm. "Close the door. We need privacy," she said, her voice low but firm. My heart skipped a beat, a strange mixture of curiosity and nervous excitement stirring in my chest. "If you like my story, then subscribe my channel." I turned to obey, my fingers fumbling slightly on the door handle. The click of the lock seemed to echo in the small room, marking a boundary between the ordinary hum of the office and something unspoken, charged, and intimate. When I returned to my desk, she was standing closer than usual, and for a moment, I became acutely aware of the subtle warmth radiating from her. There was the faint scent of her perfume, soft, floral, and oddly comforting, drifting across the desk toward me. "Sit," she said, motioning to the chair across from me. The command wasn't harsh. There was an unexpected softness beneath her usual authoritative tone. I sank into the seat, feeling the quiet tension between us settle like a tangible presence. It wasn't just her words that unsettled me. It was the way she looked at me, steady and direct, with an intensity that made me hyper-aware of my every movement. We began talking about work, of course, reports, deadlines, and the mundane stress of the office, yet the air between us seemed heavier than the subject matter warranted. My eyes kept drifting to her hands resting lightly on the edge of the desk, elegant yet unguarded, and I found myself noticing the subtle curve of her smile whenever I spoke. Each laugh or small acknowledgement carried a weight that made the room feel warmer, more intimate. I fidgeted with my pen, a nervous habit I couldn't quite suppress. Every glance her way made my pulse quicken, though nothing overt happened, no words of romance were spoken, no gestures crossed professional lines. And yet, in the silence that punctuated our conversation, something unspoken began to bloom. Something that, at the time, I wasn't sure I could name. The tension was subtle, like the barely perceptible brush of a breeze against your skin on a still day, but it lingered long after she spoke. And as I listened to her carefully measured, thoughtful words, I realized that this ordinary afternoon had shifted. The ordinary had become charged, the professional tinged with something quietly personal. And I couldn't stop noticing every small movement, every shared breath, every fleeting glance, as if the room itself was holding its breath alongside us. The office felt smaller once the door was closed, the faint hum of the air conditioner filling the spaces between our words. She settled into the chair across from me, her posture effortless yet commanding, and I couldn't help but notice how naturally she seemed to occupy the space, confident, yet inviting in a way I hadn't anticipated. We began discussing the project in detail, our conversation professional at first, carefully measured. But the proximity, the quiet room, and the warmth of her presence made the ordinary exchange feel charged. Every small movement became a signal. The way her fingers lingered over her notebook, how her gaze occasionally softened when I offered insight, or how she leaned slightly forward as if sharing a confidence meant only for me. I caught myself watching her gestures, trying not to let my attention linger too obviously, yet drawn irresistibly to the subtle grace in each motion. When she reached for a pen, our hands nearly brushed. That fleeting contact, almost accidental, sent an unexpected ripple through me. My pulse quickened, and I felt the warmth in my chest spread outward, but we both laughed lightly, pretending nothing had happened. The humor only deepened the intimacy, a quiet acknowledgement of something neither of us wanted to name yet. She leaned back, crossing her legs, and I noticed the soft curve of her ankle beneath the hem of her skirt. My mind flinched with awareness, and I shifted slightly in my chair, trying to regain composure. And then, just as suddenly, she smiled, a small, knowing curl of her lips that made my throat tighten. Her eyes held a depth of understanding, a silent question I wasn't ready to answer aloud. We fell into a rhythm. I spoke, she listened intently, and the occasional touch, a hand brushing the edge of a paper, a light tap on the desk, created a subtle dialogue beyond words. The room seemed to contract around us, the outside world fading away until it was just the two of us, orbiting one another in a delicate, almost fragile tension. There was an almost imperceptible warmth when she shifted her chair closer, leaning slightly as she reviewed a document. I noticed the soft sound of her breath, the faint scent of her perfume, the careful cadence of her voice. Each detail anchored me to the moment, made me aware of the quiet electricity in the space between us. Yet, despite the tension, there was comfort in her presence. I felt seen, not just for my work, but in a way that brushed against my thoughts, my emotions. And in the small gestures, a fleeting touch of a pen, a subtle shift in posture, I began to sense that this privacy she requested was about more than the project. By the end of our discussion, either of us had spoken explicitly about what hovered beneath the surface, but we didn't need to. The silence carried it, thick and warm, like a secret shared between two people who knew the rules but were quietly bending them, just a little. And as I left the desk to gather the final papers, I realized that my focus had shifted entirely. It was no longer just about the project. It was about her, the way she moved, spoke, and existed in the room, and how, even without words, she had changed the rhythm of my day. After the paperwork was sorted and the office quieted into a comfortable lull, I noticed her shoulders tense slightly, as though she was carrying something heavier than the afternoon's tasks. She leaned back in her chair, fingers laced loosely in her lap, eyes distant for a moment. I felt a hesitation ripple through me. The professional barrier remained, but a softer, more human side of her was beginning to appear. She sighed lightly, a sound almost swallowed by the quiet hum of the office. "Sometimes," she began, her voice low, "it feels like everything depends on me. Every decision, every deadline. I can't afford to let anyone down." There was no dramatization, no seeking sympathy, just honesty, quietly offered, like a door left slightly ajar. I shifted in my chair, careful to maintain the balance between attentive and respectful. "You've handled so much already," I said softly. "I know it's not easy, but you're not alone. I'm here to help, however I can." Her gaze flicked to mine then, and for a heartbeat, I felt an unspoken weight lift slightly. The warmth in her eyes wasn't just gratitude, it was trust. In the subtle tilt of her head, the faint rise and fall of her breath, I realized she was allowing me into a space she rarely let anyone enter. She leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on the desk, and for a moment, our hands hovered near one another as she reached for a pen. The near touch was electric, a gentle reminder that this connection was quietly shifting. I noticed the softness of her skin, the warmth of her proximity, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, all of it grounding me in the moment. "I don't often let people see this side of me," she admitted, voice just above a whisper. "Most think I'm always in control, always confident. But sometimes..." She trailed off, eyes momentarily glancing away, and I felt the delicate fragility beneath her composed exterior. I reached for the papers in front of me, keeping my hands visible and calm, yet aware of the closeness between us. "It's okay," I said gently. "You don't have to carry everything alone. And you don't have to hide it from me." She looked back, meeting my gaze, and I saw the faintest softening in her expression, a vulnerability that made her more beautiful than any polished confidence ever could. Her smile was small, almost shy, but it carried warmth, a quiet acknowledgement of trust and connection. The conversation shifted naturally then, to lighter topics, yet the tension didn't disappear. It morphed into a comfortable, intimate understanding, a shared rhythm of dialogue where glances and subtle gestures spoke as loudly as words. When she adjusted the papers on her side of the desk, her hand brushed against mine, and the fleeting warmth lingered longer than it should have. By the time our discussion ended, the professional layer remained intact, but beneath it, an unspoken bond had begun to form, a delicate intertwining of trust, understanding, and quiet attraction. I realized that what started as an ordinary office interaction had become something far more profound, something that neither of us could ignore. The office had settled into a quiet rhythm by mid-afternoon, the golden sunlight softening through the blinds and casting long stripes across the floor. We were reviewing a set of reports together, leaning over the same document, our chairs close enough that I could feel the faint warmth of her presence even without touching. There was a new subtle awareness in the room, a fragile tension that hadn't been there before, something unspoken but unmistakable. She reached across the desk to adjust the alignment of the papers. Our hands brushed. Just a fleeting contact, nothing deliberate, nothing overt, yet I felt it reverberate along my arm. The warmth of her skin lingered like a spark, and I found myself holding my breath for a fraction of a second, not wanting to break the fragile connection. Her gaze met mine, and there was a flash of acknowledgement, a soft, almost imperceptible smile, as if she too had felt the significance of the touch. We laughed lightly at some minor mistake in the report, yet even in laughter, the quiet intimacy remained. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and I noticed the faint tension in her jaw easing. Every small gesture, the way her fingers hovered near mine, the tilt of her head as she read a line aloud, the softness in her voice, pulled me further into the moment. She asked me to move a chair closer so she could see a detail on the report more clearly. I complied, careful not to make it obvious, but the proximity made it impossible not to notice the subtle scent of her perfume mingling with the office air. Her hair brushed against my arm as she leaned over the papers, sending a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the room temperature. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, the mundane task of reviewing documents transformed into an intimate, unspoken dialogue of glances, subtle gestures, and shared breath. "Thank you," she murmured softly, her hand brushing mine again as she straightened. The contact lingered just slightly longer than necessary, enough to feel deliberate but innocent. I couldn't help but notice the softness of her fingers, the warmth that radiated through her touch, and the unspoken reassurance it carried. It was not a romantic advance, not yet, but it was intimate enough to awaken a new awareness between us. The rest of the afternoon passed in a quiet, shared concentration. Every minor movement, reaching for a pen, pointing to a line on the page, leaning closer to read a small note, became charged with subtle significance. There was a rhythm forming between us, a dance of proximity and fleeting touch, of mutual awareness and restrained emotion. When the meeting ended, she stood, and for a brief instant, our hands met as she picked up the papers. The warmth lingered in my memory long after she returned to her desk, leaving me acutely conscious of the slow, steady pull between us. It was a touch that said so much without words, a delicate acknowledgement of closeness, trust, and the silent beginning of something neither of us had yet named. And as I left the desk to gather my own things, I realized that the day had changed. What started as a simple office interaction was now layered with subtle tension, quiet longing, and an unspoken understanding that something extraordinary was quietly unfolding between us. The office was dimming into the warm hues of late afternoon, the golden sunlight filtering softly through the blinds. Papers were stacked, and computers hummed quietly, but neither of us seemed to notice the tasks at hand. Our conversation had drifted from work to more personal topics, books, music, even fleeting memories from childhood. The shift was subtle, almost accidental, yet it carried with it a quiet intimacy neither of us had spoken aloud. She laughed softly at one of my stories, a sound that lingered in the air, warm and inviting. I found myself studying the delicate lines around her eyes, the way her lips curved naturally, the gentle cadence of her voice as she spoke. It was easy to see why people admired her from afar, confident, poised, effortlessly graceful. But now, in this quiet, private space, I noticed the depth behind her exterior. She wasn't just my boss. She was someone who could stir feelings I hadn't expected, someone whose presence made the room feel simultaneously lighter and heavier, intimate and charged. At one point, she adjusted the angle of her chair, and our knees brushed under the desk. The contact was accidental, yet electric, brief, yet enough to send a warmth through me that lingered far longer than it should. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the faint brush of her movement against me, a whisper of closeness that was entirely innocent, yet entirely intimate. We fell silent for a few moments, just looking at each other, a quiet pause that carried more meaning than any words could. Her eyes held a softness I hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. I noticed how she unconsciously leaned slightly closer when she spoke, how her hand rested lightly near mine on the desk, how every small gesture carried an unspoken weight. "I never expected this," she said finally, her voice low, almost hesitant. She glanced away briefly, then back at me, and in that look, I understood she wasn't speaking about the work. She was acknowledging the tension that had built slowly, silently, between us, the unspoken awareness of desire that neither dared to name. I swallowed hard, careful to keep my composure, but inside my mind raced. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the space with a touch or a gentle word, yet I also wanted to respect the fragile boundaries we were treading. Instead, I let my eyes convey what I couldn't yet say aloud: attentiveness, admiration, a quiet fascination that mirrored hers. The moments continued like this, punctuated by light touches, a hand briefly brushing against mine while reaching for a pen, the faint warmth of her arm as she shifted in her chair, a smile that lingered just a little too long. Each gesture, each glance, was a dialogue in its own right, a careful dance of closeness and restraint, desire and respect. By the end of the afternoon, the room had changed. The professional distance remained, but beneath it, something far more intimate had blossomed. We left with the unspoken understanding that this connection was no longer just about work, it was about the quiet, compelling pull of two people discovering each other slowly, wordlessly, and with a delicate, growing desire. The office had grown quiet again, the golden light fading to a soft, dusky glow. Papers were stacked neatly on the desk, untouched in the moment, because neither of us was really focused on work anymore. The connection between us, subtle, electric, and undeniably present, weighed on my mind. I kept stealing glances at her, noting the gentle slope of her shoulders, the way her hair caught the light, the warmth in her eyes when she met mine. And yet, beneath the fascination, a flicker of hesitation gnawed at me. I reminded myself of the lines we weren't supposed to cross. She was my boss, and I was her subordinate. Professional boundaries loomed large, and the consequences of stepping too close were not abstract. They were real, tangible, a part of every thought I wrestled with. My chest tightened as I realized how aware I was of every small gesture, every fleeting smile. I wanted to reach for her hand, to brush the hair behind her ear, to lean closer, yet I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. She seemed to sense my hesitation. Her eyes softened as she watched me, not with judgment, but with understanding. There was a pause in her words, a careful steadiness, as if she too was aware of the fragile tension. "You seem distracted," she said quietly, almost as if testing the waters. I swallowed, forcing my voice to remain calm. "Just thinking about the project. Trying to make sure I've got everything right." I wanted to laugh lightly, but the sound caught in my throat. She tilted her head slightly, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. It wasn't teasing, it was patient, gentle, understanding. And yet, it made my hesitation all the more pronounced. Our conversation shifted then, slower now, filled with careful pauses. Every glance, every movement became charged with meaning. The brush of her sleeve against my arm as she reached for a document, the tilt of her chair toward mine, even the simple act of her holding my gaze longer than necessary, each gesture pulled at something deep inside me. I wanted to act, to close the space between us, but I hesitated. Inside, a quiet storm brewed, longing versus responsibility, desire versus respect. I could feel my pulse in my temples, the warmth rising in my chest, my hands slightly trembling as I kept them visible on the desk. And all the while, I sensed her patience, her own internal balancing act of feelings and boundaries. Finally, she spoke again, softer this time. "It's rare, having someone notice the little things. The effort behind the work. The part of me people usually don't see." Her words weren't just about work. They were an invitation, subtle, delicate, yet profoundly intimate. And in that moment, I realized that the hesitation, the restraint, wasn't just mine, it was mutual. We left the desk after that, each carrying the weight of what remained unspoken. The room was quieter than before, yet charged, and the awareness of what could be, the slow, careful unraveling of feelings, lingered in the air. Both of us were caught between restraint and desire, conscious of boundaries yet drawn irresistibly closer by the invisible pull neither dared to name aloud. The day had faded into the soft glow of evening. The office, usually bustling with activity, now felt hushed and almost reverent in the quiet of the moment. The papers were neatly stacked, the computers dimmed, and the faint hum of the air conditioning filled the space like a gentle heartbeat. After hours of subtle tension, lingering glances, and fleeting touches, there was an unspoken understanding between us, a delicate acknowledgement that something extraordinary had quietly begun. She looked at me, her eyes softer than ever, carrying warmth, gratitude, and a hint of something more. I felt the steady pull of her gaze, a magnetic quietness that drew me closer without words. "Thank you," she said, her voice low and sincere, "for today, and for listening." It was simple, professional enough to be appropriate, yet imbued with emotion that only I could feel. I rose from my chair, feeling the gentle pull of anticipation mixed with hesitation. "It's my pleasure," I said softly, my voice carrying the subtle weight of feelings I hadn't yet expressed. There was a pause, a fragile space between us where everything seemed to hang, the silence filled not with awkwardness, but with awareness of the unspoken. As I gathered my things to leave, she stood as well. The room felt smaller somehow, more intimate, as if the walls themselves had drawn closer to witness this quiet moment. Our hands brushed, once, then lingered, as she handed me a small stack of documents. The warmth of her touch was comforting, grounding, and for a heartbeat, I felt the quiet steadiness of her presence in a way words could never capture. She smiled then, that subtle, knowing smile that had become so familiar over the past hours. "You've changed the rhythm of my day," she admitted softly, almost shyly, and I caught the faint blush in her cheeks. It was an honesty she rarely allowed herself to show, a rare glimpse of vulnerability and connection that made my chest tighten. I wanted to say something, anything, that could bridge the distance between respect and desire, between professionalism and intimacy. But instead I let my eyes speak for me. The lingering warmth of our shared moments, the subtle brush of hands, the quiet acknowledgement in each glance, all of it conveyed what words could not. As I stepped toward the door, I turned back one last time. She watched me, and in that look, there was a promise, not spoken, but understood. It wasn't about rushing, about immediate confession or dramatic declarations. It was about recognition, the quiet, steady bond we had begun to build, the mutual awareness of attraction and respect, and the tender possibility of what could come. The door closed softly behind me, but the feeling didn't leave. The memory of her touch, her gaze, the quiet intimacy of the afternoon lingered, a gentle echo in my chest. It was a slow-burn connection, fragile yet undeniable, a bond that promised warmth, trust, and a shared rhythm in the days to come. And as I walked away, I realized that some connections don't need words. They exist in subtle touches, in the quiet understanding between two people, in the anticipation of the moments still to come. Today had ended, yes, but in its quiet, intimate way, it had also begun.